Alright, what is poppin', people? We're back, and I've done plenty of metagame, like, just general discussion videos before, right? Be it when I'm updating the viability rankings, be it because there's a suspect test going on, be it the just Pokemon spotlights. I'm pretty into these kinds of videos, because commentary is just kind of fun, and one of the things that I'm pretty passionate about is just talking about Pokemon. With literally anyone. even my friend who literally has no knowledge of competitive Pokemon, I'll still talk about that with her. It's fun. And so, today, I do not bring you a laddering video, but I'll probably be doing that somewhat soon. Because, hey, always good to ladder. But I want to talk about something that I think is always an interesting topic. And that is Pokemon that potentially I wouldn't mind seeing suspect tested in some way. And I do this because right now, I think the general consensus for certain among Council, and I think overall even, is that the tier is relatively stable. Since the Light Clay ban happened in RU, Hyper Offense teams, which kind of had, people were a little bit worried about their effect on Pokemon like Blastoise, those have definitely fallen to the wayside. They're still viable, but not to the degree that they once were. And the metagame is certainly centralized around sort of these like balanced teams with cores of Pokemon like, a Steel type, usually Copperajah or Bronzong, and then like things like Flygon, Vaporeon, Talonflame, etc. But that's not to say that there aren't still some elements in the tier that people don't like. And that's not to say that I don't think there are maybe even some NUBL Pokemon that we could look at. And so, we'll look at those here. And I think the first one that I want to talk about is Surfetched. And the reason for that is because, to my knowledge, Council, we want to move forward with like a vote on just the item leak soon. So, might as well talk about the mon that might actually have action being taken against it in some way. So, for the unaware, Surfetched is probably just the most straightforwardly like good wall breaker in the tier. Also, I'm gonna pause it because I just realized I did not set the music to loop, so I'll be right back. Alright, sorry for that interruption. But, let's get back to what we're talking about, right? Surfetched is the best wall breaker in the tier. It's just really strong, it's got really good coverage, it's got priority even, which is really awesome as well. It's not a mon that's hard to find success with. And while at first, Surfetched was sort of just outclassed by other options like Pangoro, Beware, and even Nianshao, it's now found itself in a really good spot, and a lot of it's because of just increased, and this is like increased usage over a month plus span, just to make that clear, increased usage of Leak. And compared to Choice Band, which forces you to lock into a move, and obviously that makes first impression less reliable, Leak essentially gives you the same boost, but lets you switch moves. And that is huge, because prior, when people were mostly using CB Surfetched, despite it being really strong, you could still pivot around it. Yes, it has Scrappy, but there's still decent fighting resistance in the tier, such as, say, Vileplume, Celebi, even, like, Talonflame is okay enough at taking that CC and then, like, threatening Flame Body Burn, or even just threatening to KO a Brave Bird. But Leak complicates counterplay, because no longer can you just, try to play around first impression choice locks. No longer can you try to switch around Surfetched's coverage moves. You're now forced to read much more correctly on those turns that you're trying to play around it. Because, it's just gonna hit you with a different move the next time if you switch into an answer, Very few Pokemon are consistently able to, like, check Surfetched. You've got, like, what, Garbodor? Vileplume if it's not a Brave Bird variant, because, some have quick attack, some have poison jab. The pool of defensive counterplay to Surfetched isn't that great, and so factor in Leak just also making some other options, like, say, Mudsdale, even, like, less consistent. You got a Pokemon that's kind of, easily seen as problematic. I do think the reason that I'm not too sold on Surfetched, as of now, even needing a Leak ban, by the way, is that I do think this is something, and this is an issue I took with Mian Shao, despite it being incredibly potent. I didn't like the Life Orb sets because I felt that, like, defensively, wow. It just feels like one of those wall breakers that's pretty slow and is really easily revengeable. It doesn't have good bulk. It doesn't even have a good defensive typing. At least Pangoro had a dark typing to go with it, right? Surfetch don't even have that. And so, it's not like it's hard to deal with offensively. I do think Mons should have defensive counterplay still, at least to some extent. There's always going to be, like, really potent wall breakers in tiers. Like, look at OU with Kartana Tapu Lele. Look at UU with, let me think of UU Pokemon. Scizor. Think of RU with, like, Xurkitree. There's always still at least defensive counterplay somehow to these breakers. And I still think Surfetch does meet that criterion, right? You've got, like, Garbodor is still a... Garbodor's probably the best answer you'll get. Other Pokemon, like, say, defensive Flygon, even, they can take a hit. Talonflame can take a hit. A lot of it's just reliant on you predicting properly. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think Surfetch's really poor speed also forces it to play pretty, like, proactively if it wants to be able to dish out the most punishment possible. Again, that speed tier being so bad, which is an issue a lot of those other mons I just mentioned don't have due to, you know, some reason, Scizor having priority, Kartana just being fast. Surfetch's super poor speed makes it so, like, you know, you get a prediction wrong and someone is able to switch into you. Despite the insane amount of damage you do, you're, like, then forced out immediately, which can limit how much damage you can do throughout a battle at times. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's still hard to not acknowledge the unhealthy, I don't know if I would say the unhealthy effect as on a tier, because I always feel like that's such a vague term, unless you dive further into what you mean by that. But it's still hard to deny the fact that it's an incredibly potent breaker that kind of just invalidates certain checks by critting them. So, you know, I can still see this mod being looked into. And here's probably the most controversial Pokemon tier right now. It's just straight Blastoise. Now, I voiced my opinion on Blastoise a lot of times before. I've been pretty adamant that I'm against a suspect test or a council vote of any kind. And it's because I think Blastoise's counterplay, typically when you look at the arguments against it, they really... So, the thing I've noticed through talking with several people is people really want to assume the best for Blastoise every time. Whether it be based on the move pool, or not the move pool, I guess the move set, whether it be based on just the in-game situations that happen, people always make the best picture. And people try to also downplay, like, how consistent certain checks are. And that's not to say that, like, every answer to Blastoise is super reliable and always beats it no matter what, but it's like, just because Blastoise learns Dark Pulse does not mean that, what's called? That does not mean that Delmise is not a check to it. Just because Blastoise learns Ice Beam does not mean Vileplume is not a check to it, right? I do think it's still worth looking at Blastoise through the scope of its most common set. But, like, Blastoise drops Ice Beam sometimes for sub. Vileplume's 1000% a check to it. And so what I'm getting at here, really, is that Blastoise's sweeping potential is insane. And a lot of it does come from its combination of, like, coverage and bulk. Its coverage of, let's just put the most common set in here real quick. Shell Smash, Surf, Ice Beam, Dark Pulse. This is probably what you're going to see most of the time. But they'll go to a little wider. And then you get to go max special attack, max speed, and you even get to go modest, which is really helpful to make up for that base 85. None of the Scarfers that are too common, outside of, like, Heliolisk, can outspeed you, even if you're modest, which is good. This is the most common set. But something you gotta keep in mind is that there are other variants, and I think the most common one you'd see of a variant is Sub. And that's why I still like to consider Pokemon like, say, Vileplume as checks. Because at the end of the day, this is... I've seen this set more than once. Hoenn Confirmed runs it somewhat frequently. You 1000% have to take that into consideration. And it also means that, say, something like Toxicroak, then that becomes a much more consistent check. I was about to say Decidueye. Dragalge and Dragon types as a whole. If you're running Sub, then those become more consistent answers as well. And basically what I'm getting at is, like, while much of Blastoise's counterplay is certainly to a degree set reliance, it's not to say, like, those mons don't still check it to some degree, even if it has Ice Beam. It's just they check it much more reliably when it doesn't. While while they are reliant somewhat on Blastoise's set being something else to handle it most adequately, I think it's a disservice to just immediately throw them out and be like, no, it's not a check, because this Blastoise variant beats them. It'd be like me saying, okay, well, if I'm running physical Blastoise, then I have Earthquake to hit Dragalge, Toxicroak, and Helios, so those are never checks. You know, it's like, you can't do that. That's actually just essentially what you're doing at that point, is you're creating this, I also want to say, like, this false narrative around how Blastoise actually functions and how these interactions work. What you can't do with these arguments around a Pokemon is try to always paint a situation ideally or unideally for something. I think that's just disingenuous. And I think that's what a lot of the arguments against Blastoise and saying that it needs to be banned have done. Do I want to downplay Blastoise as some, like, really, really potent sweeper? No. Because we've seen it be pretty reasonably successful, I would say, at least on the ladder, for how many months now? Like, 2+? But I think it's worth looking at tournament games to see how it's done there. And the answer there is it's like Blastoise kind of come up short, I would say, in tournaments compared to how it looks like on the ladder. You gotta look at how Blastoise is a pretty wide pool of counterplay. Some more consistent than others, obviously, but that's how it is with everything, right? But the counterplay does exist there. It's not as, like, focused as just... It's not like it's only Spadef Vaporeon and, like, Spadef Haze Mantine, right? Are those checks? Yeah, but I don't think those are what you want to, like, be putting on every team anyway. Look at other options. Look at offensive counterplay, like Heliolisk, which Blastoise can't OHKO at +2. Look at Toxicroak, which... I'm pretty sure it takes a +2 Ice Beam, at least it's a damage roll. Things like Spadef Delmise, which not super common right now, but I do think still fits on certain structures. It takes any +2 hit, no goes even through screens with Power Whip. Basically what I'm getting at, while I think Blastoise still has a whole bunch of counterplay, if anything, I'd still be willing to let the community have a say on it. Because, hey look, it's probably the most controversial mon that we still allow in the tier. So there's something to that. And I do think, you know, if we're gonna have surveys talking about the metagame, and, you know, trying to see how the community feels, well, we know how the community feels about Stoiz, so I don't think there's any harm in letting a suspect test happen. My main point in talking about Blastoise here, though, is still to, like, reaffirm some things that I have said before. I just want to see the dialogue around Blastoise stop being so, like... I also just say weird. I don't know. I've talked about this bot enough, both before this video and in this video, so I'm gonna move on now, but yeah. Be a little bit more willing, I guess is what I'm saying, to, like, acknowledge other forms of counterplay as actual counterplay. Anyhow. So now we're gonna get the mods that I think you could justifiably try to suspect us back into the tier. While I am perfectly content letting everything in NUBL stay in NUBL, I do think there's at least a case to be made for some Pokemon in it, and I want to talk about these four in specific. Mostly because I think they've got the strongest cases. Whether or not they'd actually be balanced is entirely a different story. I want to make that very clear right here. I think there are just cases you can make for these Pokemon. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move Indeedee to the back, because I want to talk about, like, these in a certain order. So, I'm going to talk about Pangoro and Sigilyph together. Because if you remember when these two got their suspect tests and their bans, they were by really slim margins, right? It was a matter of a couple of votes that got both Sigilyph and Pangoro banned. I think you can reasonably come at this with the stance of, look at how divided we were at the time. Is it not fair to see now, in a moment of relative stability, whether or not these Pokemon would be fine to bring back? Now, I still think both Pangoro and Sigilyph would be too much. You know, I think Pangoro still has the same lack of counterplay as it did back then defensively. And I think Sigilyph still does the same stuff as it did back then. But I feel like you could argue, at least, that Pangoro and Sigil have you know, at least a case to be looked at again, just because they weren't banned very convincingly. And then Tornadus is kind of a similar story, but it's more because of another contributing factor that was around when Tornadus got banned, and that's Drizzle. So, in my opinion, and this is something that I said even around when Tornadus was present, is that I thought it was not Tornadus itself that was broken, but it was that Drizzle pushed it over the edge. When I had been using Tornadus, I had consistently felt a little underwhelmed by its performance outside of Rain, but with Drizzle support, I felt that it was legitimately the most overbearing forces in the meta. Obviously, we banned both it and Drizzle at the same time, and so we never got to see Tornadus by itself, unless, you know, you just used it independent of Drizzle, which people did do, and some people still felt that it was too much. But I do think, still, seeing it in a meta where you are literally being forced to use it without auto Rain support, and that's not to say you couldn't still make Rain teams with it, I'm sure people would, but seeing it in a world without getting Drizzle, especially with options like, say, Heatproof Bronzong rising up in usage, with a lot of the Scarfers that are present being able to heavily pressure it, with a lot of just generally bulky Pokemon like Spidef Spidef Diancie, Spidef Vaporeon, these kinds of mons existing that can sort of just contend with Nasty Plot Tornadus, or just special attacking Tornadus in general, I think it could be worth looking into. I'm not super sold on Tornadus because at the end of the day, I just look at what it does offensively and I get a little bit like... I get filled with this level of dread that probably, you know, speaks to how threatening Torn would still be, even without Raid, right? But it's another mod where it's like Pangoran Sigilif that I'm not sure that it's just not a mod that I feel was very firmly banned. Okay, well, let me rephrase that. These two, they just weren't very firmly banned, and in Tornadus, I think you could even try to, like, put some of the ban reasoning on another factor. And so I can kind of look at all three of these as it's like, give them another shot just to give them another shot. You know, at the worst, you lose, what, 2 weeks of a meta? But I digress. Let's go on to NDD. This is the sole mon in NUBL that I look at and I actually think would just be fine. And this is obviously not an opinion shared with everyone, but my thing with NDD male mostly comes down to that I look at NDD female, and this is not the best argument, I'm aware, but let me make my case. So, NDD female is quite literally not seen in NU in any serious capacity right now. And there are a couple of reasons, partly because it's just walled by a lot of stuff, and it's also outsped by a lot of stuff. NDD male is a little stronger and a little faster, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure if that is enough to save it from being... Let me rephrase that. I'm not convinced that NDD male's increase in damage output and speed is enough to make it, like, too much for the tier. I personally feel that NDD male struggles with the same stuff that NDD female does. It just has a slightly easier time coping with it. So, like, Steel-type prevalence, you've got a whole bunch of Bronzong and Kabaraja, especially Heatproof Bronzong. NDD male does more damage to them, but at the end of the day, these are mons that do prevent the spam of Expanding Force, which would be the big, you know, scary move. And even the prevalence of, like, Drapion and Guzzlord does that too. Hyper Voice, yeah, it does a lot to them, but if you can try to force NDD male into not spamming out the really, really powerful move, I do think that matters for something. And also, the prevalence of, like, Protect right now is pretty high, I would say. You've got Toxic Protect Bronzong, you've got Protect on Sylveon and Vaporeon, even these mons that just run a lot of special bulk and can afford to scout NDD if they need to. Hell, Mudsdale, it runs Protect a lot, and so if you're trying to do some core of, like, NDD plus physical pivot, i.e. Flygon, Talonflame, Simeon, mons that, you know, maybe a Mudsdale would be kind of keen on letting itself come into and then seed momentum versus, well, it can still scout, and that gives you a good amount of leverage. Ninjaski, even if you want to throw that mod out there, you know, it always sees some weird amount of usage. Now, I mean, that's not a mod that you need to protect versus Indeedee, but if it's Scarf, I guess. I just feel like, again, protect is pretty common, and that would give you a good amount of leverage around this Pokemon. I also, and again, this just goes back to like the defensive structures that you see. I feel like a lot of them are reasonably prepped for Indeedee. Maybe this is still, at the end of the day, hoping for a little bit too much, because Indeedee is really ridiculously strong still anyway, with Psychic Terrain plus Expanding Force. But it's just, I look at NUBL and I'm like, if there's any one Pokemon that I would be willing to say might be okay, it'd be Indeedee. And that's not to say that right now I think we should just free it, because I do still think there are matters we should contend with. I honestly would like to see one of these addressed in some way, if only because they're the two most mentioned mons by the community at the moment. But if we ever look to free something, I personally would push for it to be Indeedee. That's my take here. Disagree if you want to, because it's certainly, I don't think Indeedee's the mod most people would jump to at the beginning to say, ah yes, let's retest X, Y, or Z. I feel like if anything, it would probably be, again, maybe like one of these. I've seen a few people mention like these two at least, in some similar vein to what I've said. Hell, maybe even someone would be willing to test one of the Pokemon that really loved dual screen support. Look, I don't want Lanoon or Slurpuff back, but maybe there's people that think those two could be balanced. I'm not one of them, but, I'm sure they exist. That's gonna be it for this video, though. Yeah, I got even up here. Maybe suspect test these, because then again, am I really sold on any of these? Not necessarily. I just think there's a case to be made for all of them, right? Be that case strong or weak, you can decide there. But I think it's always fun to talk about some hypotheticals, because they're pretty low they don't have very high consequences. Just have the discussion around it. I hope you guys did enjoy this, and I do want to hear y'all's thoughts below on like anything you think might be worth testing, especially if it's down from NUBL. I'm just curious, how do y'all feel about what's currently banned? Do you think anything up there should be given a second chance? The one problem I would say if we were to try to suspect anything this month is just July tier shifts. We're going to lose Flygon, and that is quite an integral piece to the tier, so it would result in a fairly sizable shakeup. But only time will tell what that really ends up doing for the tier. And until then, hey, let's have some fun. At least with, like, theory modding. I'll see you guys next time. Take care.